He had always felt music in a way that words could not explain. Even as a young boy, he would stop whatever he was doing to listen whenever he heard a piano. The notes seemed to reach into him, stirring something deep and quiet that he didn't fully understand. He didn't know the names of chords or scales, and he had never had a lesson. Still, when music played, he could feel its shape and color, like it was a living thing inside him. It was the one thing that could make the world feel softer, warmer, and full of hope. His days were simple, often quiet, and sometimes lonely. He didn't have many friends, and the people around him didn't always notice him. But music was different. It listened to him without judging, and he could pour every thought, every worry, every spark of joy into it, even if it was only in his imagination. Every night before sleeping, he would hum melodies he had invented, letting them float around his small room until they were part of the air itself. One day, he walked through the center of town and saw something that made his heart jump. In a public hall, placed proudly on a small stage, was a grand piano. Its polished wood shone under the lights, and the black and white keys seemed to promise a world of possibilities. He stopped in his tracks. He had seen pianos before, but this one felt different. Felt like it was waiting for someone. Felt like it had been placed there just for him. He moved closer, careful not to touch it, just staring at it with wide eyes. He could imagine the sounds it might make, the songs it could hold, and for a moment, he felt that familiar mix of excitement and fear. People passed by, chatting and laughing, not noticing him or the piano. But he couldn't look away. He felt a pull he couldn't resist, like the piano was calling to him, and he had to answer. A small knot of courage formed in his chest. He wanted to touch it, to let his fingers glide over the keys, even if just for a second. He didn't know what would happen, but he knew he had to try. He stepped closer, his heart beating fast, and hesitated for a moment. The piano looked delicate and perfect, almost sacred. He whispered to himself, telling himself to be careful, to be gentle, to respect it. Finally, he gathered enough courage to ask. His voice was soft, almost shaking, but it carried the weight of all his longing. He asked if he could touch the piano, just for a moment. The people nearby turned to look at him. Some frowned. Others whispered among themselves. One person shook their head and said no. The rejection stung, but he didn't protest. He tried to explain, saying how much music meant to him, how he could feel it inside him, how he only wanted to try. Still, the answer was no. They didn't trust him. They thought he might break it or that he wasn't skilled enough. He felt his shoulders slump, but he didn't give up. Something inside him refused to let this be the end. He stood there, silent for a moment, staring at the piano, letting the shine of its keys reflect in his eyes. He took a deep breath and reminded himself that sometimes dreams need patience, and courage is not just in winning, but in trying. Minutes passed. He tried to imagine the sound of the first note, how it would feel to press the keys and hear something real, not just imagined. He could picture the vibrations in his fingers, the way the melody might rise and fall, the way it might make someone smile or stop and listen. He could almost hear it in his mind, and it made him shiver. Music wasn't just something he wanted to touch. It was something he needed. It was part of who he was. He watched the people around him. Some had started to leave, dismissing him as just another boy with an impossible dream. Others were curious but hesitant. Their eyes flicked to him and then to the piano, wondering what he might do. He didn't mind their doubt. He only knew that he had to be ready when the chance came. He practiced in his mind, imagining the first note, the second, the third, and how they would flow together. Each imagined note gave him strength. As he waited, he thought about every time music had saved him. The nights he felt scared or alone, he would hum his little songs until his fear faded. The days when he felt invisible, he would imagine music that could make people notice, even if just for a moment. The piano now stood before him, real and tangible, and for the first time, it felt like his music could step out of his imagination and into the world. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, feeling nervous but alive. He told himself that he had nothing to lose and everything to gain. He looked at the piano keys again, seeing the black and white pattern that promised endless possibilities. Each key was a story waiting to be told, a feeling waiting to be released, a chance to show the world what he had carried inside for so long. The people around him were still watching, some with skepticism, some with mild curiosity. He noticed a slight softening in one older man's expression, as if he could feel the boy's longing, though he didn't understand it. That small change gave him hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone would see not just a boy asking to touch a piano, but someone carrying a universe of music in his heart. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling both long and fleeting. He took another deep breath, steadying his hands and his mind. He whispered to himself that it was not about proving anything to anyone, but about honoring the music inside him. That thought gave him a strange calm. The fear didn't disappear, but it became something smaller, something manageable. Finally, he made a decision. He would wait for the right moment, no matter how long it took. He would be patient, respectful, and ready. He couldn't rush the world to understand him, but he could be ready when the world gave him a chance. The piano remained silent, waiting, and he remained there, heart pounding, eyes bright, spirit alive. Even in that quiet hall filled with strangers, he felt a connection that nothing could break. He imagined that first note again, soft but clear, carrying a part of him into the room. He imagined it surprising people, touching them in ways they hadn't expected, making them pause, maybe even smile. He imagined that one moment of courage could open a door that had seemed impossible to reach. And in that imagining, he felt hope. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet, persistent kind that grows in small hearts and refuses to die. Even though he was still waiting, still uncertain, he knew one thing for certain. He would not walk away. Not now. Not ever. Music had found him long ago, and now he had found music. The grand piano, with its polished wood and perfect keys, was no longer just an object. It had become a symbol of possibility, a reminder that dreams could be within reach if one dared to ask, to wait, and to hope. And so, he stood there, small yet unshakable, dreaming in plain sight, ready for the moment when the piano would finally allow him to speak with the only language he truly understood. The boy had stood by the piano for what felt like hours, listening to the quiet of the hall and imagining the first note he would play. But soon, the calm began to shift. People started noticing him, and not in a way that welcomed him. Some whispered to each other, casting glances that made him feel smaller than he already was. A few shook their heads, muttering about rules and caution. The piano, which had seemed like a door to a world of possibility, now felt guarded, untouchable, as if it belonged only to those deemed worthy. He swallowed hard, trying not to let the doubt in their faces reach him. Still, it was hard not to feel their judgment. Every frown, every skeptical look, felt like a barrier he couldn't break. Yet, inside him there was a flicker of stubbornness. Music had never failed him. It had always been there, even when the world seemed to ignore him. He could feel it now, whispering to him, reminding him that he had a right to be here, even if others didn't understand. He tried to explain politely, telling them he only wanted a moment to touch the keys, to feel the piano beneath his fingers. He spoke softly, careful with his words, hoping that the sincerity in his voice would reach them. But their reactions were mixed. One person frowned and said it was impossible. Another simply looked away, pretending he hadn't spoken. The rejection weighed on him, but it didn't break him. He had faced doubt before, though never like this, and he knew that to give up now would mean letting go of a piece of himself. Despite the rejection, he didn't leave. He remained there, standing near the piano, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. He imagined the sound of the first note, letting it echo in his mind. He pictured the crowd going quiet, feeling the way music could stop people in their tracks. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about sharing a part of himself that had lived in silence for too long. He wanted them to hear what he carried inside, even if they didn't understand it fully. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. Some people started to move away, leaving the hall emptying slowly. Others lingered, curious but uncertain. A few faces softened, and he noticed a slight change in their expressions, as if they could sense the longing in him, though they didn't know what to do with it. That small shift gave him hope. Perhaps, if he waited long enough, someone would see past the rules and barriers and recognize his passion. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to calm the nerves that twisted in his stomach. He reminded himself that he didn't need permission to dream, only patience and courage. He took a deep breath, imagining himself seated at the piano, feeling the keys under his fingers, letting music flow freely. He could see it in his mind as clearly as if it were already happening. The anticipation made his heart race, but it also strengthened his resolve. He would not leave without trying. The boy looked at the people around him again. Some had grown impatient, sighing or muttering about the delay. Others seemed more thoughtful, watching him quietly, unsure how to respond. He noticed an older woman standing near the doorway, her eyes soft and curious. She didn't speak at first but seemed to understand something about the boy that the others didn't. That small acknowledgement gave him a sense of connection, a reminder that he was not completely alone in his longing. He continued to plead, carefully and respectfully, explaining how music had always been his way of expressing things he couldn't put into words. He spoke of nights when he hummed melodies to calm himself, of the comfort he had found in imaginary songs, and of the dreams he held for the first time of sharing them with others. Each word carried his sincerity, and slowly, he felt a subtle shift in the energy around him. People were listening more intently, some even leaning slightly forward, drawn by the quiet intensity of his voice. Time seemed to slow as he waited for a response. He could feel every heartbeat echoing in his chest, every small movement of the crowd magnified in his perception. He tried to stay calm, but the tension was almost unbearable. The piano, still gleaming under the lights, seemed both impossibly distant and urgently near. He wanted to reach out, to touch it, to let his fingers speak for him. But he had learned that patience was part of the journey, and he was willing to wait for the right moment. As the minutes dragged on, he began to imagine what would happen if he were finally allowed to play. He pictured the first note, soft and tentative, followed by another that carried more confidence, and then a melody that would fill the room, shifting the atmosphere from skepticism to wonder. He could almost feel the vibrations of the keys under his fingertips, the way the sound would resonate in the space, touching everyone present in ways they didn't expect. That mental rehearsal brought a sense of calm and purpose, reinforcing his determination. He noticed the expressions of the crowd changing gradually. Some were still doubtful, but curiosity had started to replace the initial skepticism. The whispers became softer, and a few people began to stand still, watching him with cautious attention. He felt a strange sense of anticipation, knowing that the moment could come at any second, and he had to be ready. The piano was no longer just a distant dream. It was a potential reality, waiting for someone brave enough to step forward. The boy thought about all the times he had felt unseen, unheard, and dismissed. Those experiences had taught him resilience, the quiet strength that grows in solitude. Music had been his companion through every lonely night, every uncertain day. Now, faced with the chance to bring it into the world, he felt both fear and excitement intertwining in his chest. He understood that the world might not understand him, might not even approve, but that could not stop him from trying. He adjusted his stance, standing tall despite the nervousness that coursed through him. He whispered to himself, reminding himself of the joy music had given him, the solace it had provided, and the hope it had nurtured. He told himself that he had a right to pursue this moment, that his passion mattered, and that the piano was a bridge between his inner world and the outer one. With each passing second, his resolve grew stronger. People continued to watch him, some with patience, some with doubt, and others with a budding curiosity that he could feel like a gentle wind pushing him forward. He took another deep breath, imagining the flow of notes he would play, the rhythm of his fingers, and the emotions that each sound could convey. The visualization gave him courage, transforming the nervous energy into a focused determination. He felt ready, even if the opportunity had not yet arrived. Finally, he noticed a subtle shift in the hall. One of the attendants, who had been observing quietly, took a step forward. He felt a small surge of hope, mixed with apprehension. The attendant looked at the piano, then at him and seemed to hesitate, as if weighing the risk against the boy's evident passion. That moment of indecision felt like a turning point, and the boy's heart raced with anticipation. He stayed perfectly still, not wanting to break the fragile balance of possibility. The boy realized that he had been waiting not just for permission, but for recognition. He wanted someone to see not just a boy asking to touch a piano, but someone with a deep connection to music, someone who had nurtured it quietly and faithfully for years. The thought made him even more determined. He straightened his back, squared his shoulders, and let his gaze meet the attendant's, silent but full of meaning. He was ready for whatever came next. Time seemed to stretch again, and the hall held its breath along with him. The boy imagined the first note again, feeling its weight and resonance, imagining the subtle ways it would move through the room, softening doubts and inspiring awe. He imagined each person present feeling something unexpected, a gentle tug at their hearts that could not be ignored. The anticipation was almost overwhelming, but he welcomed it, knowing that it was part of the journey. As he waited, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Every moment of doubt, every night of humming melodies alone, every day spent dreaming in silence had prepared him for this. He felt gratitude for the quiet strength he had gained and for the music that had never left him. The piano was more than an instrument now. It was a symbol of all the perseverance, hope, and love that had carried him to this moment. Even as he remained still, the boy could sense the energy in the room shifting subtly. Curiosity, interest, and maybe even a hint of belief were beginning to replace the initial skepticism. He felt a small but powerful connection with the people around him, as if the unspoken language of music had already begun to reach them. That thought filled him with warmth and a quiet confidence. He knew that if given the chance, he could transform hope into reality. And so, he waited, patient and unwavering, holding on to his dream with a strength that came from years of nurturing it in silence. The piano remained in its place, gleaming and inviting, and the world around him continued its quiet motions, slowly bending toward the possibility of something extraordinary. The boy stood ready, heart pounding, mind clear, and spirit alive, knowing that his moment, when it came, would change everything. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a small opening appeared. One of the attendants stepped closer to the boy, and although his expression was cautious, there was a trace of curiosity there. He hesitated, glancing at the piano and then back at the boy, as if silently asking if he was truly ready. The boy nodded, heart hammering in his chest. He didn't speak, for he didn't need to. His eyes said everything, his longing, his patience, his respect for the instrument. It was the only moment that mattered. He stepped forward slowly, his fingers hovering just above the keys. The wood felt cool under his hands, and the polished surface reflected his nervous face. The piano seemed alive somehow, as if it sensed the weight of his dreams and the years he had spent imagining this very moment. He took a deep breath, feeling every heartbeat echo through his body, steadying himself for what was about to happen. The people around him watched in silence. Some still carried doubt, but a few faces softened with curiosity. The older woman who had been standing quietly by the doorway smiled slightly, as if she knew this moment was long overdue. The hall was still, every whispering voice hushed, as though everyone could feel the tension and anticipation pressing into the air. Time seemed to stretch, holding its breath alongside him. He pressed his fingers lightly onto the keys. The first note sounded soft, tentative, almost hesitant, but it carried something unexpected, a spark of emotion that drew every eye toward him. He felt it vibrate in his fingers, and a warmth spread through him, giving him confidence to continue. The melody began to flow, hesitant at first, then more sure, moving like a river finding its path. The sound filled the room, shifting the atmosphere, making the air seem alive with possibility. The people around him could not look away. Whispers stopped, conversations paused, and the usual bustle of the hall faded into silence. Even those who had doubted him found themselves leaning closer, drawn into the magic that unfolded from the piano. The boy did not notice them. Not really. He was lost in the music, each note carrying a piece of his soul, each chord a fragment of every dream he had ever held. As his fingers moved across the keys, the music grew bolder, yet remained tender. He had never been taught, had never practiced formally, yet his fingers seemed to know the language instinctively. Each sound he created was honest, pure, and unpretentious. It was as if he had discovered a secret world within himself and was finally letting it be known. The room was no longer just a hall. It was a vessel for the beauty he had carried silently all these years. People began to shift in their seats and positions, drawn into the performance. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them, feeling emotions they hadn't expected. Others leaned forward, mesmerized, unable to tear their gaze from the piano and the boy who played it. Faces that had been skeptical softened. Mouths that had been frowning now relaxed into expressions of awe. Even the attendants who had doubted him now watched with admiration. Their earlier caution replaced by wonder. He did not think about the crowd, about approval, or about judgment. His focus was entirely on the music. He imagined stories in the notes, painting pictures in the minds of those who listened. A laugh here, a sigh there, the gentle swell of hope and longing, and sometimes a sharp note that startled but captured attention. He allowed his emotions to guide him, letting his imagination flow freely across the keys. The hall seemed to breathe with the music, alive in ways no one had anticipated. For a few moments, he forgot entirely about the world outside the hall. There was no time, no rules, no fear of failure. Only the music and him, intertwined, creating something that felt larger than himself. His heart felt full in a way that it never had before, and a smile, small but genuine, tugged at his lips. He felt free, liberated, as if he were speaking a language only he knew, and yet everyone could understand it in their own way. The audience could feel the emotion too. Some eyes glistened with unshed tears, moved in ways they could not explain. The music seemed to bypass words and logic, speaking directly to the heart. Even those who had doubted his skill were now captivated, unable to imagine how someone with no formal training could produce such depth and beauty. It was a reminder that talent and passion often exist quietly, waiting for a single chance to be seen. As the melody continued, he explored different tones and tempos, creating a tapestry of sound that was both simple and profound. He shifted from gentle, lilting notes to stronger, more commanding ones, letting the music ebb and flow like waves in a vast ocean. The piano became an extension of his own being, each note a breath, each chord a heartbeat. The hall vibrated with the resonance of something more than sound. It was a shared experience, a moment of connection between the boy and everyone present. Time seemed to blur as he played. He lost count of the minutes, lost track of the murmurs that had existed before. The music had its own rhythm, its own life, and he surrendered to it completely. Every movement of his hands felt instinctive, natural, as if he had always known how to speak in this language. The more he played, the more he realized that the music had always been inside him, waiting patiently until he was ready to release it. When he glanced briefly at the audience, he saw faces transformed. People were no longer thinking about rules, restrictions, or doubts. They were simply experiencing, feeling, and being moved. Some whispered to each other in awe. Others held their breath, not wanting to break the spell. The boy felt a strange mixture of humility and pride, knowing that his music had touched hearts in a way words never could. He continued, letting the melody grow richer, more expressive, carrying with it all the years of longing, patience, and quiet hope that had brought him here. Every note was deliberate yet effortless. Every chord was full of meaning. The piano, once untouchable and forbidding, had become a partner, responding to his touch, echoing his emotions, and amplifying the music that had always existed only in his mind. At one point he paused for just a second, catching his breath. The hall was so quiet that he could hear the subtle hum of the piano, the soft intake of breaths from the audience, and the distant echoes of the notes that had lingered in the room. That brief silence was not empty. It was filled with anticipation, as if the world itself were waiting to see what would come next. He smiled faintly, knowing that he had captured their attention, and that the music was weaving a connection that could not easily be undone. He resumed, the next notes flowing seamlessly into the previous ones, building a story without words. The melody rose and fell like waves, carrying listeners along a journey that was both familiar and new. Each transition was natural, each harmony sincere. The boy felt a sense of fulfillment, as if he were finally living a truth he had long dreamed of sharing. The piano was no longer just an object. It was a doorway into something far greater than himself, a bridge between imagination and reality. The audience responded in subtle ways. Heads nodded, eyes widened, lips parted in awe. Some tapped lightly on their laps, almost unconsciously, following the rhythm. Others closed their eyes, letting the music envelop them completely. The boy felt a warmth spread through him, the kind that comes when something deeply personal resonates with others. It was not applause, not yet, but a silent acknowledgement that he had given them something real, something unforgettable. He played on, moving from gentle passages to moments of intensity, letting the music speak with its own voice. He felt free to explore, to experiment, and to express emotions he had never spoken aloud. The piano had become a vessel for everything he had carried silently for years. His dreams, his fears, his joy, and his hope. And in that shared experience, he realized that the world could sometimes surprise you, that patience and persistence could lead to moments of pure magic. By the time the melody reached its peak, the room was completely captivated. No one dared to interrupt, no one spoke. The boy felt a profound connection to every person present, as if they were all sharing in something intimate and extraordinary. The music had become a conversation without words, a bridge between hearts. And for the first time he felt seen, not just by one person, but by an entire room that had once doubted him. Finally, he began to bring the music to a close. The final notes echoed gently, fading into a silence that was both powerful and tender. The boy's fingers lingered briefly on the keys, feeling the resonance settle into the room. He sat back, breathing deeply, feeling both relief and joy. The piano, once a distant dream, had become an extension of himself, and the experience had left an imprint on everyone present. The hall remained quiet for a heartbeat, then a soft murmur began, growing steadily into applause. Some people rose to their feet, others clapped gently, but all were moved. The boy looked up, seeing smiles, awe, and respect in the eyes of those who had doubted him. It was a moment he would never forget, a confirmation that dreams, patience, and courage could create something truly extraordinary. The music had spoken for him, and the world had listened. The room was still, filled with a quiet that felt almost sacred after the boy's first notes. Everyone had been watching, captivated. But now the silence that followed was even more powerful. It was a pause heavy with emotion, a moment where no one moved or spoke, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The boy's fingers lingered on the keys, feeling the vibrations settle, feeling the connection he had created. It was not just music. It was a bridge between hearts, a language that needed no words. He looked up briefly, seeing the faces around him. Some had tears in their eyes, others had wide, astonished expressions, and a few were simply frozen in awe. For the first time, he understood the power of what he had done. His music had reached out to people, had touched something deep and unspoken within them, and had made them pause to feel. That realization filled him with a warmth that made him smile softly. It wasn't pride in himself, not in the usual sense, but a quiet joy in knowing that something inside him had connected with the world outside. The boy continued to play, letting the melody flow naturally, guided by the emotions he felt. He was no longer conscious of rules, technique, or fear of judgment. The music came directly from his heart, and each note carried honesty and feeling. He allowed the soft, tender parts of his soul to be heard in gentle, lingering tones, then shifted to stronger, more confident passages, expressing excitement, hope, and joy. The room seemed to move with him, breathing in his music, sharing in the journey he had created. People were moved in different ways. Some closed their eyes, feeling memories and emotions the music awakened. Others watched with rapt attention, as if seeing something magical unfold before their eyes. A few whispered to themselves, moved without understanding why. The boy did not notice them individually, but he could sense the collective energy, the shared feeling that had grown in the room. The music had transformed the hall from a place of rules and doubt into a space of connection and wonder. As he played, he thought about all the times he had been told he couldn't do something, all the moments he had been dismissed or ignored. Those experiences, which once felt heavy and discouraging, now seemed to have led him to this moment. Each note he played was an expression of all the hope, perseverance, and quiet dreaming that had carried him through those times. He realized that his music could not only express his emotions but also reach others in ways words never could. The audience was visibly affected. Some shifted in their seats, moved by the crescendos and falls of the melody. Others reached out instinctively, as if trying to hold onto the emotion that was filling the space. Even those who had been skeptical earlier were now caught in the spell of the music. There was no doubt, no judgment, only the raw impact of something beautiful and real being shared. The boy's hands moved effortlessly, translating every feeling into sound, every dream into melody. He explored new harmonies, changing the rhythm and pace to express the different emotions he felt. Gentle, soft notes created a sense of peace and tenderness, while faster, more powerful passages expressed excitement and hope. The audience could follow the story without needing words, experiencing the highs and lows, the tension and release, and the deep honesty of the music. The hall became a shared space, where the boy and the listeners were connected through the invisible threads of sound. At one point, he allowed a note to linger, holding it just a little longer than expected. The resonance filled the room, vibrating in the chest of everyone present, and for a moment, the music seemed to touch something ancient and familiar within them. He felt their presence not as an audience but as participants in the story he was telling, connected through emotion and imagination. The music was no longer just his own. It belonged to all of them in that space and time. The boy felt his confidence growing. He was no longer worried about mistakes or judgment. The piano had become an extension of himself, responding naturally to his touch. The melodies flowed without hesitation, expressing his thoughts, feelings, and dreams in a pure form. The audience continued to react, some with tears, some with smiles, and others simply with wide-eyed wonder. The music had become a silent conversation, a way to speak without words, a connection that went beyond anything spoken aloud. He explored the quieter moments, letting the sound fade into delicate whispers that drew listeners closer, demanding attention without forcing it. Then he contrasted them with bolder, more dramatic sections, creating a journey full of emotion and nuance. The audience was captivated, moved, and in awe of what was unfolding. No one could predict the next note, the next chord, yet every sound felt purposeful and right. It was the purity of expression that made the experience unforgettable. As the boy continued, he noticed small reactions. A hand pressed to a chest, a tear rolling down a cheek, a breath held in anticipation. Each subtle movement reminded him of the power of music, the way it could bypass intellect and speak directly to the soul. He understood, more than ever, why he had spent so many years dreaming in silence, why he had waited so patiently for this opportunity. The piano was giving him a voice, a way to communicate what he could not say with words, and he embraced it fully. He began to slow the tempo, guiding the music gently toward its conclusion. The final notes were soft, lingering, and full of feeling. The room seemed to stretch with the sound, holding on to each note as if unwilling to let it go. The audience was silent, entranced, caught in the final moments of the journey. The boy's hands rested lightly on the keys, feeling the echoes resonate within him and around him, marking the end of a story told entirely through music. When the last note faded, the hall remained quiet for a heartbeat. Then, gradually, the applause began, first softly, then growing louder until it filled the entire space. Some people stood, clapping and cheering, while others remained seated, overwhelmed by the beauty they had witnessed. The boy looked up, seeing expressions of amazement, pride, and respect in the eyes of those who had doubted him only moments before. He felt a sense of fulfillment, not from the applause itself, but from knowing that his music had truly touched people. People approached him, offering smiles and kind words. Some spoke softly, asking how he had learned to play, expressing their awe and admiration. The boy shook his head, smiling gently, feeling a mix of humility and joy. He knew that his skill had come not from formal lessons but from years of listening, imagining, and dreaming. Every melody, every note had been nurtured in silence until this moment, and now it had been shared with the world. The boy walked away from the piano slowly, still feeling the vibrations in his fingers and the warmth in his chest. The hall seemed brighter somehow, transformed by the music that had just filled it. He realized that the impact of this moment would last far beyond the applause, beyond the faces that had witnessed it. The music had planted something in the hearts of those present, a reminder of beauty, hope, and the power of following one's passion. Even after leaving the hall, he felt the echo of the experience inside him. Every note, every chord, every subtle change in rhythm had become a memory that he could carry with him forever. He had not only played the piano, he had shared a part of himself that had always existed quietly, waiting for the right moment. And in doing so, he had changed the way people saw him, the way he saw himself, and perhaps even the way they would think about the quiet power of dreams. The music had been more than a performance. It was a declaration, a statement of hope, courage, and expression. It had proven that patience and belief in oneself could create moments of extraordinary beauty. The boy understood now that the piano had not just given him a chance. It had given him a voice, a way to communicate the depth of feeling that had lived inside him for so long. And for everyone who had listened, it had been an invitation to feel, to connect, and to remember that sometimes the simplest acts can carry the most profound meaning. The boy stepped back from the piano, feeling the last echoes of the melody lingering in the hall. His hands still tingled from the vibrations, and his heart felt lighter than it had in years. He had not expected anything like this. Not the stillness, not the awe, not the way people had leaned into the music as if it could carry them somewhere new. He realized, in that quiet moment, that something inside him had shifted. He had taken a dream from silence and made it real. People began to speak, softly at first, then louder, as the spell of the music faded into admiration and applause. The doubts and skepticism that had surrounded him earlier were gone, replaced by respect and wonder. Faces that had frowned or looked away now looked at him with awe, some even with tears in their eyes. He understood, finally, that his music had touched something deep, something universal that words alone could never reach. It was not just a performance. It was an opening, a way to connect hearts across space and time. Some approached him, speaking quietly, asking how he had learned to play. The boy smiled gently, knowing that the answer would be difficult to put into words. He had not been trained, not in the way most people understood learning. He had trained himself in listening, in dreaming, in imagining melodies in silence. He had practiced patience and hope. Every note had come from the heart, every chord from the quiet spaces of longing he had carried for so long. This was the secret of his music, and he hoped that those who listened could feel it. He wandered slowly through the hall, feeling the energy that remained from the music. Some people still clutched their chests, moved in ways they could not explain. Others whispered to each other, sharing the experience, trying to put into words what they had just felt. The boy realized that his music had created something larger than himself, something that could live in the hearts of those present long after he left. It was a strange, wonderful power, and he felt gratitude, awe, and humility all at once. As he walked, he noticed that the older woman who had been quietly observing smiled warmly at him. Her eyes held understanding and encouragement, a silent acknowledgement of the years of patience, dreaming, and courage that had led him here. That small smile felt like recognition, and it warmed him more than applause ever could. He realized that moments like this were rare, not because talent was rare, but because patience, belief, and courage were rarer still. He thought about all the times he had been ignored, told no, or overlooked. Those moments had been painful, but now he understood their purpose. They had taught him endurance, resilience, and the ability to treasure the moments when opportunity finally arrived. Each hardship had been a step toward this, each disappointment a teacher, each longing a fuel for his passion. Now, standing in the aftermath of the music, he could see the invisible path that had led him here, and it filled him with quiet satisfaction. He imagined the piano again, its polished surface reflecting the lights and the faces of the people around him. It had been more than an instrument. It had been a doorway, a mirror, a companion. Through it, he had spoken a language that no one could misinterpret. The keys had been his voice, and the music had been the truth he had carried inside for years. It was a language that transcended age, experience, and expectation, and in that, he found freedom. The audience had begun to disperse slowly, still speaking in low tones, sharing the impact of the music. Some walked away with tears on their cheeks, others with eyes wide in wonder. The boy watched them go, feeling a strange satisfaction that was different from pride or self-recognition. He had given them an experience, a memory, a moment of beauty that they could carry with them. And in giving it, he had also given himself something far greater, the knowledge that he had been true to his heart, and that truth could resonate beyond himself. He reflected on how different things had been before he approached the piano. Fear, doubt, hesitation, rejection, they had all seemed so insurmountable at the time. Yet, here he was, having transformed those feelings into something extraordinary. The lesson was clear. Courage was not the absence of fear, and talent was not always what was measured by formal training. Sometimes, it was the quiet persistence, the belief in oneself, and the willingness to reach toward a dream that created real magic. He looked back one last time at the piano. The instrument had been silent now, but it held the memory of the music, the echo of his hands, and the traces of emotion that had filled the room. It was as if the piano itself had witnessed the journey, understood the story, and had allowed him to speak through it. He bowed his head slightly in thanks, a small gesture of reverence for the object that had opened a door he had long hoped existed. As he stepped out of the hall, he felt a sense of calm joy. The world outside had not changed, but he had. The music had shown him the strength of his dreams, the power of patience, and the beauty of sharing something deeply personal with others. He knew that life would continue with its challenges, its doubts, and its obstacles. But he had proof now that one small moment of courage could make all the difference. Walking home, he replayed the experience in his mind, each note, each pause, each emotional wave that had filled the hall. He realized that the music was not just for the audience, but also for himself, a reminder that he was capable of creating beauty, touching hearts, and being seen in the way he had always hoped. That knowledge was a treasure, a seed for future dreams, and a beacon of hope for every time he would face doubt again. When he reached his room, he sat quietly, remembering the faces, the reactions, and the energy that had filled the hall. He thought about the older woman's smile, the astonished looks, and the soft, lingering applause. All of it had become a part of him, a part of his story, and a confirmation that his passion, patience, and courage were worth everything he had endured. He felt a deep, abiding gratitude, not just for the music, but for the journey that had brought him to this extraordinary moment. The boy understood that life would present new challenges, new doubts, and new opportunities for fear and rejection. But he also knew that he had learned something essential, that hope, patience, and the courage to try could create moments of transformation. That music, art, or passion could speak louder than fear or doubt, and that sometimes the smallest actions, a touch, a note, a dream, could have effects far greater than he could imagine. He imagined the piano again, and in his mind he played a quiet melody, not for an audience, but for himself. It was a song of gratitude, of joy, of triumph, and of connection. The memory of the hall, the faces, the awe, and the silent acknowledgement of his effort all blended into a perfect harmony that he would carry forever. It was the reward for believing in himself, for following a quiet longing, and for daring to ask for a chance. As the night deepened, he drifted to sleep with a sense of peace and accomplishment. The music had not ended with the final note. It had woven itself into his life, a permanent reminder that courage, passion, and patience could overcome doubt. The experience had changed him, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, lasting knowledge that he had reached his dream and shared it with the world in the most profound way possible. And so, the boy slept, carrying the echo of his own music in his heart, ready for whatever the next day, the next challenge, or the next opportunity might bring. He knew now that his journey had only begun, and that the power to create, to connect, and to inspire had always been within him, waiting for the moment when he would finally reach out and let it be seen.